Enemy's entering full combat! Cool enough feedback indexing!
What if a B-17 Flying Fortress was literally cut in half at 24,000 feet? Beherman, cannon fire, the tail section barely hanging on by control cables, and the wounded radio operator Gunnar, blinded by blood and shrapnel in both eyes, still kept firing his .50 caliber machine gun out the shattered waist window all the way down to save his crew. On December 20th, 1943, at approximately 11:30 a.m. over northern Germany, Technical Sergeant Forrest Lee Vossler of the 303rd Bomb Group clung to his gun in the radio compartment of B-17F Jersey Jackass. A 20mm cannon shell from a Luftwaffe fighter tore through the fuselage just behind him, severing the aircraft at the waist. The tail section, including the tail gunner, dangled by control cables, and shredded skin, swaying wildly in the slipstream. The bomber lurched into a steep dive. Oxygen lines ruptured. Freezing air roared through the gap. Vossler hit in the face, eyes, legs, and hands by fragments and secondary shrapnel, was temporarily blinded by blood pouring into his eyes. Pain seared through him. Vision was gone, yet he refused to stop. Feeling for the gun mount with mangled hands, he swung .50 caliber Browning toward the open waist window and kept firing defensive bursts into the sky. Long-aimed streams of tracers arcing out. Even as the plane plummeted, German fighters circled, probing for the kill. Vossler's fire, blind but disciplined, forced them to break off or risk collision. He continued shooting until the bomber leveled off at lower altitude and limped toward the English coast. This moment stands as one of the war's most extreme examples of refusal to quit. The B-17 was structurally destroyed. Tail half gone, fuselage severed, yet Vossler, nearly blind and bleeding heavily, kept his gun active for the entire descent, protecting the crew from further attacks. His actions allowed the pilot to nurse the bomber back across the North Sea for an emergency landing. Vossler survived, though permanently scarred, vision loss in one eye, partial in the other. He received the Medal of Honor on August 31st, 1944. The citation explicitly credits him with continuing to fire despite the fact that the aircraft was cut in half and despite his own grave wounds. The shock lies in the sheer physical impossibility. Blinded, mutilated, in a plane breaking apart at altitude, he still fought. No surrender, no giving up the gun. Only relentless bursts into the darkness he could no longer see. The incident occurred on December 20th, 1943. During one of the 8th Air Force's most punishing unescorted daylight bombing missions of the war, the raid on the Focke-Wulf aircraft factory in Bremen, Germany. At that stage of the air campaign, long-range fighter escorts like the P-51 Mustang were not yet available in sufficient numbers. B-17s flew deep into the Reich, protected only by tight combat box formations and their own defensive armament. Losses were catastrophic, often 10 to 20% per deep raid, as Luftwaffe fighters, Bf-109 Segundas FW-1 90s used head-on attacks, and aggressive tail pursuits to break formations. Jersey Jackass, B-17, F-Serial 42, 29831, 303rd Bomb Group. 427th Bomb Squadron took off from RAF Molesworth, England, as part of a 300-plus bomber force. The target was heavily flak was accurate, and German fighters swarmed in relays over Bremen. The group endured intense barrages. Jersey Jackass took multiple hits. Flak and cannon shells, riddled wings, fuselage, and tail. A 20mm round from a fighter, likely BF-109 or FW-190, struck just behind the radio room, slicing the aircraft almost completely in two at the waist. Only control cables, hydraulic lines, and shredded skin held the tail section to the forward fuselage. The bomber lurched into a steep dive. Oxygen lines ruptured. Freezing air howled through the gap. Vossler, the radio operator and waist gunner, was stationed in the radio compartment. The explosion sent shrapnel into his face, eyes, legs, and hands. Blood poured into his eyes, blinding him temporarily. The tail gunner was killed or incapacitated. Other crew wounded. Pilot and co-pilot fought to level the aircraft at lower altitude. Vossler, despite his wounds and blindness, crawled to his .50 caliber gun in the waist window and resumed firing defensive bursts. Guided by sound, feel, and memory of gun mount position, whenever enemy fighters approached, the event mattered because it exemplified the extreme resilience required of bomber crewmen in 1943, when unescorted daylight raids were at their deadliest. The B-17's legendary toughness allowed Jersey Jackass to remain flyable, despite near-fatal structural damage. Vossler's continued fire, blind and wounded, deterred further close attacks, giving the pilot time to stabilize and head for England. The bomber made an emergency landing at a coastal airfield. The crew survived. Vossler was evacuated to hospital, treated for multiple wounds and vision damage, permanent loss in one eye, partialing the other. He received the Medal of Honor on August 31st, 1944. The citation highlights his gallantry and intrepidity in continuing to fire, despite the fact that the aircraft was cut in half, and despite grave personal injury. The story underscores how individual determination could preserve life in moments of catastrophic failure. December 20th, 1943, 11:15 a.m., local time over, northern Germany, near Bremen. Technical Surgeon Forrest, radio operator and waist gunner aboard B-17F Jersey Jackass City au 42, Navi, 8, 303rd Bomb Group, 427th Bomb Squadron, manned his .50 caliber Browning in the radio compartment. The mission to the Focke-Wulf factory had turned lethal. Heavy flak over the target knocked out Engine 4, damaged Engine 2, severed hydraulics and oxygen lines, shattered the nose and tail. Fighters swarmed to dawn attacks, killed the bombardier and tail gunner, wounded others. The intercom died. Most guns jammed or destroyed. Pilot and co-pilot fought to keep the bomber level as it fell out of formation, trailing smoke at 24,000 feet. A 20mm cannon shell from a Luftwaffe fighter, likely Bf-109 or Fw-190, struck just behind the radio room. The explosion severed the fuselage at the waist. Metal screamed as the tail section tore free. Only control cables, hydraulic lines, and shredded skin held the rear to the forward fuselage. The bomber lurched into a steep dive. Freezing air howled through the gap. The tail gunner was killed instantly. The tail section dangled, swaying wildly in the slipstream. Vossler, stationed in the radio compartment, took the blast full force. Shrapnel tore into his face, eyes, legs, and hands. Blood poured into his eyes, blinding him instantly. Pain seared through him. Vision vanished into red darkness. The plane plunged. Altitude dropped rapidly 24,000 feet, toward 15,000, then lower. Oxygen masks failed. Crew voices faded on the dying intercom. Vossler refused to stop. Feeling for the gun mount with mangled hands, he swung the .50 caliber Browning toward the open waste window. He could see nothing, only hear the roar of wind, the groan of straining metal, the distant chatter of enemy guns. He fired blind bursts long, sweeping arcs into the sky whenever he sensed movement or heard engines. Tracers streamed out. German fighters, probing the straggler, broke off or risked collision. Vossler kept firing, reloading by touch, conserving ammunition with disciplined bursts. Twists came relentlessly. The bomber leveled at lower altitude, but fighters circled again. Vossler, blood dripping from his face. Continue dish, burst guided by sound and memory of gun traverse. A Bf-109 closed from 6 o'clock. Vossler swung the gun, fired. The fighter veered away, trailing smoke. Another Pasif W-190 from high right. Vossler, led by instinct, fired again. The attacker broke, disappeared. Heroics lay in endurance. Blinded, bleeding. In a plane breaking apart, Vossler kept his gun active for the entire descent. No panic, only mechanical repetition. Field amount. Swing, fire, reload. He protected the crew from further close attacks, giving the pilot time to stabilize and head for England. The B-17 limped across the North Sea, altitude bleeding but holding. Losses severe. Bombardier and tail gunner dead. Others wounded. Vossler's wounds. Gray face, lacerated. Eyes damaged, permanent loss in one. Partialing the other. Legs and hands torn. The aircraft structurally destroyed. Tail dangling yet flew on sheer pilot skill and Vossler's defensive fire. Technology. Weapons. M2.50. Caliber Browning. Machine gun waist mount. 600 rounds. 850 revolutions per minute. M1 Garand. Rifle backup. B-17. F defensive layout 13.50. Total, though most inoperable after damage. No radar or advanced sights. Vossler fired by feel and sound in total visual darkness. Emergency landing at a coastal airfield in England around 14 o'clock. The bomber touched down hard, skidded, stopped. Ground crews rushed in. Medics pulled Vossler from the radio compartment. Face, bloody-eyed eyes, swollen shut, but conscious. He was evacuated to hospital, treated for multiple wounds and vision damage. The peaked as the severe B-17. Jersey Jackass plunged through 24,000 feet toward lower altitudes over northern Germany on December 20th, 1943. 20mm cannon shell had cut the fuselage just behind the radio compartment, the tail section dangling by control cables, and shredded skin swayed violently in the slipstream. Freezing air roared through the gap. Oxygen masks failed. Technical Sergeant Forrest Lee Vossler, blinded by blood pouring into his eyes from facial wounds, felt the plane lurch into a steep dive. Pain seared through his torn legs and hands. Shrapnel had shredded his uniform, yet he refused to release his .50 caliber Browning. He groped for the gun mount by touch, swung it toward the open waste window, and kept firing long, sweeping bursts into the blackness whenever he heard enemy engines or sensed movement. Tracers streamed out blindly. German fighters probing the straggler veered away or risked collision. Vossler reloaded by feel, conserving ammunition with disciplined bursts. The bomber leveled at 15,000 feet, then lower. The tail section still hung, control cables straining. Altitude bled 12,000, 10,000, 8,000 feet. Fighters circled again. Vossler fired at the sound of engines. A Bf-109 closed from 6 o'clock. Vasilar swung the gun, fired. The fighter broke off trailing smoke. Tension gripped the aircraft. The pilot and co-pilot wrestled controls to prevent a fatal spin. The tail gunner was dead or incapacitated. Vasila, vision gone, pain overwhelming, continued each burst to gamble in darkness. He could not see tracers, could not confirm hits only. Hear the roar of his gun, feel the recoil, smell the cordite. German fighters made one final pass. Vosler fired again. The attackers peeled away, perhaps mistaking the blind fire for coordinated defense. Resolution came slowly. The B-17 limped across the North Sea at low altitude. Engines straining, controls heavy. Vosler's gun fell silent only when ammunition ran low and threats diminished. He slumped against the bulkhead, bleeding heavily, consciousness fading. The bomber crossed the English coast, pilot calling Mayday. Rough Koltischol cleared the grass strip. Wheels touched hard, skidded, stopped in dust and smoke. Ground crews rushed in. Medics pulled Vasila from the radio compartment. Face lacerated, eyes swollen shut with blood, legs and hands torn. He was conscious, but fading. Evacuated to hospital, treated for multiple wounds and vision damage, permanent loss. In one eye, partial in the other. The aircraft was scrapped, too damaged to repair. The crew survived. Vosler's blind fire had deterred close attacks, giving the pilot time to stabilize. Debriefing followed. Crew reported enemy aircraft breaking off after Vosler's bursts. Official claims credited him with continued defensive fire despite catastrophic damage and personal wounds. He received the Medal of Honor on August 31, 1940. For the citation notes, he continued to fire his gun, despite his wounds and the fact that the aircraft was cut in half, driving off attackers and protecting the crew. The lesson emerged with stark clarity. Duty and resolve can endure when everything else fails. Vosula, blinded and mutilated in a plane breaking apart at altitude, never released his gun. He fired by instinct and memory, protecting men he could not see. In darkness, he could not escape. No surrender. No giving up the fight. Only relentless bursts until the threat passed. His actions saved the crew from further close attacks, allowing the bomber to reach safety. No grand tactical victory, just survival through unyielding will. Vosla survived the war, scarred but alive. His story reminds that in moments of total collapse, structural, physical, visual, courage can still hold the line. One man, blind and bleeding, kept shooting all the way down, proving that even when the world goes dark, the fight can continue. Reflecting on the desperate descent of Jersey Jackass on December 20th, 1943, Forrest Vosler's refusal to stop firing stands as one of the war's rawest examples of unbreakable will. The B-17 had been cut nearly in two. At 24,000 feet, fuselage severed just behind the radio compartment, tail dangling by control cables, freezing wind howling through the gap. Shrapnel tore into Vosler's face, eyes, legs, and hands. Blood flooded his vision, blinding him completely. Yet in that moment of catastrophe, when most would have collapsed, he groped for his .50 caliber Browning by touch, swung it toward the shattered waist window, and kept firing defensive bursts into the darkness he could no longer see. He fired blind, guided only by sound of engines, memory of gun traverse, and sheer determination. Each burst deterred German fighters probing the straggler, buying seconds for the pilot to level the dying bomber and limp toward England. Vasila reloaded by feel, conserved ammunition with disciplined shots, never releasing the gun even as pain overwhelmed him. The tail swayed wildly. The plane bled, altitude 24,000 feet to 15,000, then lower. He continued until threats faded and the bomber crossed the North Sea. Vosler survived the emergency landing, though permanently scarred, vision lost in one eye, partial in the other, body torn by shrapnel. He received the Medal of Honor on August 31st, 1944. The citation credits him with continuing to fire, despite the fact that the aircraft was cut in half and despite grave wounds, protecting the crew from further attacks. The power of that descent lies in its refusal to yield. Vosala could have let go bleeding, in a plane breaking apart at altitude. Instead, he fought on, turning personal ruin into collective survival. His story reminds us that courage is not the absence of pain or darkness, but persistence through it. When sight failed, when the aircraft failed, when the body failed, resolve did not. One man, blind and broken, kept shooting all the way down, proving that even in total collapse, the fight can continue until the end. Like if Vosala's blind stand moved you. Comment your thoughts what hits hardest about firing in total darkness. Subscribe for more forgotten World War II stories of courage against impossible odds. We have written the sources from which we got this story in the description of this video, and we have always been and will be supporters of the oppressed, regardless of their color, race, or country. This world and its creator are also with the oppressed. See you in the next WWII story.